Imagine being humiliated in front of your entire class, your intelligence questioned, your dignity stripped, by the very teacher who's supposed to guide you. But what if that teacher didn't know? The student she was bullying was actually the principal's son. What happens next will shock everyone. Sit down where you belong. The sharp, cutting words sliced through the classroom air like a whip, leaving a sting that every student could feel. The chatter in the room died instantly. Pencils froze mid-scribble, and dozens of eyes swung toward the classroom door. Standing there, framed by the doorway, was a new face. Marcus. A tall, soft-spoken black teenager, no older than 16, clutching his backpack straps so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he shifted nervously, unsure why the teacher's voice had carried such venom before he had even spoken a word. Mrs. Thompson, Jefferson High's strictest math teacher, stood at the front of the class with her arms crossed. She was known for her iron discipline and her sharp tongue, but today, her glare carried something colder. Her narrowed eyes raked Marcus up and down like she was inspecting a criminal instead of a student. "You think you can waltz into my class late?" she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "Not in here. You kids need discipline." Marcus blinked, startled. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just sent by the office. I'm new here." His words were careful, polite, almost pleading. But Mrs. Thompson didn't soften. In fact, her lips curled into a smirk that made the entire room stiffen. She tilted her chin slightly higher, raising her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Figures. Probably can't even read the syllabus." The words hit like a thunderclap. A few kids gasped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One boy at the back muttered, "Whoa," but quickly lowered his eyes when Mrs. Thompson glanced his way. The room grew painfully silent. Marcus felt heat flood his face. His chest tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump rising in his throat. He had expected the first day at a new school to be difficult. New faces, new routines, but he hadn't expected humiliation before even introducing himself. He stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, his legs stiff, as if his body wanted to turn and run. But instead, he forced himself to take a step forward, then another, until he reached the nearest empty desk. Each movement felt heavy, as though the silence of the entire classroom pressed down on his shoulders. As he slid into the chair, he avoided everyone's eyes. Some of the students watched him with sympathy, others with curiosity, but no one dared to speak up. After all, this was Mrs. Thompson. Nobody challenged her. At the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson turned back to the chalkboard with a satisfied expression, as if she had just proven a point. She began writing equations, her sharp handwriting scratching across the board, but the air in the room still felt electric with discomfort. Marcus pulled out a notebook and quietly opened it. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his pencil on the page. He told himself to breathe, to focus. He had been through challenges before. He would endure this too. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the sting of her words. Not because they embarrassed him, he had enough confidence in himself to know his worth, but because they revealed something uglier. Something he had seen before, in small glances and whispered tones, but never so openly in a classroom. He tightened his grip on the pencil, staring at the equations on the board. His mind wasn't on math anymore. It was on the echo of her insult, the look of discomfort on his classmates' faces, the knowledge that none of them truly knew who he was. Because Marcus wasn't just another transfer student. He wasn't just a quiet kid trying to fit in. He was the son of Principal Harris, the very man who ran Jefferson High with fairness and integrity, who had dedicated his life to protecting students from injustice. And little did Mrs. Thompson know, the boy she had just humiliated in front of everyone was no ordinary student. He was the principal's son. And soon, her cruel words would come back to haunt her. The following days were no better for Marcus. If the first insult had been a cruel welcome, the rest of the week became a relentless storm. Mrs. Thompson seemed to have made it her personal mission to single him out. Whenever Marcus raised his hand to answer a question, her gaze slid past him like he wasn't even there. She'd call on anyone else, even students who clearly didn't know the answer, just to avoid acknowledging him. And when Marcus finally got a chance to speak, when his words proved that he understood the lesson, she found a way to twist the moment into humiliation. One morning, Marcus solved a tricky algebra problem on his paper. He raised his hand politely, and when no one else seemed willing to answer, Mrs. Thompson finally called on him with a sigh. "Fine, Marcus. Let's see what you've got." He explained step by step, his voice steady, his reasoning flawless. When he finished, the room was quiet, and for a fleeting second, he thought maybe, just maybe, he had earned her respect. But Mrs. Thompson's lips curled into a sneer. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That was impressive. Almost too impressive. Someone must have whispered that in your ear." The class shifted uncomfortably. A couple of students exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. Marcus felt the heat of 100 eyes on him. His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to sit tall, to keep his expression calm. "Don't pretend to be smarter than you are," Mrs. Thompson added, her tone sharp and cold. A faint ripple of gasps moved through the room. Some students looked down at their desks, others at Marcus with sympathy. But no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge a teacher. This became the pattern. If Marcus answered correctly, she accused him of cheating. If he didn't raise his hand, she accused him of being lazy. If he worked quietly, she accused him of not paying attention. It seemed that, in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, Marcus could do no right. At lunch, a few students whispered about it. "Why is she always picking on him?" one girl muttered. Another shrugged nervously. "I don't know, but I'm not getting involved. You know how she is." And so, the cycle continued. Everyone saw, everyone knew, but no one said a word. Marcus, however, endured it in silence. Each cruel remark stung, yes, but he didn't let it break him. Instead, he absorbed it like stone against rain, standing firm against the storm. He had grown up watching his father, Principal Harris, fight battles that weren't easy. Meetings where fairness was questioned, decisions where equality had to be defended. Marcus had seen his father's strength, his patience, his ability to let truth speak louder than anger. And so Marcus learned to do the same. He wasn't weak, though Mrs. Thompson believed she had cowed him into submission. Every time she mocked him, he reminded himself who he was. Not just a student, not just a target, but the son of a man who believed in justice. At night, as he sat in his room replaying the insults in his head, he clenched his fists but took slow breaths. His father had always told him, "The moment will come when you won't have to shout to be heard. You just have to wait for the right time." And so Marcus waited. He waited through the glares, through the sarcasm, through the false accusations. He waited while his classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing they wanted to say something but didn't. He waited through each day, carrying himself with quiet dignity. Mrs. Thompson thought she was breaking him. She thought her words were cutting deep enough to crush his spirit. But Marcus wasn't breaking. He was sharpening. Because what Mrs. Thompson didn't know, what she couldn't even begin to imagine, was that her cruelty was only fueling his resolve. And when the right moment came, when the truth finally surfaced, the lesson she thought she was teaching Marcus would turn into the lesson of her life. Marcus wasn't waiting out of fear. He was waiting out of strength. And soon, Mrs. Thompson would learn exactly who she had been underestimating all along. One Friday afternoon, the tension finally snapped. The classroom buzzed with restless energy. It was the last period of the week, and students were eager to escape into their weekend. But at the front of the room, Marcus stood at the chalkboard, gripping the piece of white chalk between his fingers. His heart pounded, but his mind was sharp. Mrs. Thompson had called on him to solve one of the most complicated problems in the chapter, a problem several students had already failed to complete. "Go on, Marcus," she said, her tone dripping with challenge, as though daring him to stumble. "Show us what you can do." For a moment, the room was still. Then Marcus began to write. His hand moved carefully, deliberately. He wrote each step clearly, explaining as he went. Numbers flowed across the board in neat, confident strokes. His voice, though calm, carried strength, as though each word was a quiet rebellion against the doubt and ridicule he'd endured all week. As the problem neared its end, students leaned forward in their seats. They could see it, the logic, the precision, the brilliance. And then, with one final line, Marcus circled the correct answer. Silence. And then applause. Genuine, spontaneous applause. Several students grinned, impressed by his skill. For the first time since he'd arrived at Jefferson High, Marcus felt a flicker of pride, of belonging. He had proven himself, not just to Mrs. Thompson, but to the entire class. But the moment didn't last. Mrs. Thompson's marker slammed against the desk with a crack that silenced the room. Her face was hard, her eyes sharp with disdain. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice cutting through the air. There's no way he figured that out on his own. The applause died instantly. Gasps rippled across the room. Marcus froze, the chalk still in his hand, his chest tightening, as if the air had been stolen from the room. "What do you mean?" he asked softly, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. Mrs. Thompson folded her arms, tilting her head with a mocking smirk. Someone like him doesn't belong in advanced math. The words hit like a brick wall. His classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of her statement sinking in. Some students looked down at their desks, ashamed, while others stared at Marcus, wide-eyed, unsure of what to do. Marcus's throat tightened. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his voice quiet but steady, though his hands trembled at his sides. "Yes," Mrs. Thompson said coldly. "You know exactly what I mean. Students like you are always troublemakers, never scholars. Don't stand here pretending you're something you're not." The cruelty in her tone sliced deeper than any insult before. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. His mind screamed with words he wanted to say, defenses he wanted to shout. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. Strength isn't about anger. It's about knowing when to speak and when to wait. So Marcus said nothing. He dropped the chalk onto the tray, the small clatter echoing in the silent room. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the classroom. The door closed behind him, leaving behind stunned silence. The rest of the students sat frozen, staring at Mrs. Thompson in disbelief. For the first time, some of them began to see clearly what had been happening all along. That night at dinner, Marcus was unusually quiet. His fork moved slowly across his plate, pushing food rather than eating it. His father, Principal Harris, noticed immediately. "What's wrong, son?" he asked gently, setting down his glass. Marcus hesitated, his chest heavy with the weight of everything he'd been carrying. Finally, he lifted his eyes and spoke. The words spilled out. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment of injustice. He told his father about being ignored, accused, mocked, and finally humiliated in front of the entire class. Principal Harris listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. His eyes darkened, not with sadness, but with a deep, controlled anger. When Marcus finally finished, his voice trembling, there was a heavy silence between them. His father reached across the table, resting a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Marcus," he said, his tone steady, "you should never have had to endure that. No student should. And tomorrow, we're going to handle this." Marcus swallowed hard, unsure what that meant. "Dad," he began, but Principal Harris stopped him with a reassuring nod. "You've been strong. You've shown patience. And now it's time for the truth to come out. But remember this, you son, will have the last word." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The storm wasn't over, but the tide was about to turn. Monday morning arrived, but it didn't feel like any ordinary start to the week. The halls of Jefferson High buzzed with whispers, hushed conversations carrying from locker to locker. Something unusual was about to happen. Word had spread quickly. The principal himself was coming to Mrs. Thompson's class. Nobody knew exactly why, but rumors swirled. Rumors about Marcus, about the way Mrs. Thompson had treated him, and about what might unfold today. By the time the bell rang, the classroom was filled with restless energy. Students shifted in their seats, glancing toward the door every few seconds. Mrs. Thompson, however, acted as though nothing was out of the ordinary. She stood tall at the front of the room, writing equations on the board, her chalk strokes sharp and deliberate. Her smile was tight, rehearsed, like she was trying to convince both herself and the class that everything was normal. But then the door opened. Principal Harris stepped inside, his presence commanding instant silence. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in his usual dark suit that seemed to radiate authority. His calm but steady gaze swept across the classroom. No one dared to whisper now. Even Mrs. Thompson's chalk froze against the board. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," he said evenly, his tone polite but edged with something that made the air feel heavier. She spun around, forcing a bright smile. "Principal Harris." "What a surprise," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. He didn't return the smile. Instead, he turned to the students, then back to her. "I hear there have been issues." And then the door opened once more. Marcus entered. He walked with his shoulders squared, his chin slightly lifted. His eyes were steady, not defiant but strong. For the first time, he wasn't the quiet boy shrinking into his seat. He was standing tall, standing proud. Gasps rippled through the classroom. Murmurs swept like a wave. The principal's son? That quiet kid Mrs. Thompson had been humiliating. Him? Mrs. Thompson's fake smile faltered instantly. Her face drained of color as she darted a glance between Marcus and the principal. "Sir, I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. But Principal Harris raised his hand, silencing her. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "I want to hear from the students," he said. The class froze. For a moment, nobody spoke, uncertain whether they should. But then, a voice rose from the back. "She always ignores him," a girl said quietly. Another student chimed in, a little braver. "Yeah, every time he answers, she acts like he's cheating." More voices followed, gaining confidence with each word. "She told him he couldn't be smart because of, she treats him differently from the rest of us." It's been happening every single day. The room filled with the voices of truth, one after another, like a dam finally breaking. Students who had stayed silent for too long now spoke up, their words tumbling out, each confession adding weight to the growing pile of evidence. Mrs. Thompson's face paled. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to interject. But each time she opened her mouth, another student spoke up, cutting her off. The mask she had worn so confidently, her authority, her control, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. She tried to laugh nervously, waving a hand. "These are exaggerations. Children misunderstand things. You know how it is." But Principal Harris's gaze cut through her excuse like a blade. His voice, calm but unshakable, filled the room. "No, Mrs. Thompson. I know exactly how it is. And I've just heard it from the mouths of your students. The ones you were supposed to guide, not belittle." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Thompson's shaky breath. She looked around, desperate for someone to defend her, but not a single student spoke in her favor. Even those who once kept their heads down now stared at her with something between disappointment and defiance. Marcus stood quietly beside his father, his expression calm but resolute. For once, he didn't feel invisible. For once, he wasn't the one silenced. And Mrs. Thompson, who had built her power on intimidation and cruelty, realized with dawning horror that her students had found their voices, together. Principal Harris's voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Every word seemed to echo in the silent classroom. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his eyes locked on her trembling figure. "Education is about lifting students up, not tearing them down. It is about giving every child the chance to believe in their potential, to grow, to learn. You failed at that. You failed as a teacher. Worse," he paused, his voice hardening. "You failed as a human being." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mrs. Thompson's lips parted as though to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for someone, anyone, to defend her. But all she found were the faces of her students, the very children she had dismissed, belittled, and insulted. And not one of them came to her aid. I didn't mean," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It was just misunderstandings. I never." But her excuses fell flat. The damage was done. Everyone in that room had witnessed her cruelty. Everyone had heard the truth from the mouths of her students. Her reputation, once built on strict authority, now lay in ruins. Principal Harris turned to the class. "No student should ever feel small in a place meant to help them grow," he said. "You are here to learn, to become the best versions of yourselves. If anyone ever makes you feel less than that, you must speak out. Because silence allows injustice to thrive." His words resonated deeply, and for the first time, many of the students felt empowered. They realized that their voices carried weight, that even against someone in authority, truth could not be silenced forever. Mrs. Thompson was placed under investigation that very week. Soon after, she was removed from the classroom. The news spread quickly through the school. Students whispered in the halls, some shocked, others relieved. And when the announcement was made, cheers erupted, not because a teacher was gone, but because justice had finally been served. Marcus, who had once walked those same halls in silence, now walked with his head held high. He was no longer just the new kid. He had faced cruelty head-on and emerged stronger. His classmates now saw him differently. Some patted his back in the cafeteria. Others smiled when he walked into class. He was no longer invisible, he was respected. That evening, as Marcus and his father walked home together, Principal Harris rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "You see, son," he said softly, "strength isn't about fighting back in anger. It isn't about shouting the loudest or hitting the hardest. Real strength is about patience. It's about holding on to your dignity when someone tries to strip it away. It's about letting truth shine when the time is right." Marcus nodded, the words settling deep in his heart. He had wanted to lash out so many times, but now he understood. His silence hadn't been weakness. It had been power waiting for the right moment. From that day forward, Marcus became more than just a student at Jefferson High. He became a symbol of courage, a quiet reminder that dignity could stand taller than cruelty. His story spread through the school like wildfire. Younger students whispered it with admiration. Older ones carried it like a lesson. And though the math class eventually got a new teacher, the memory of what had happened in that room never faded. Students didn't just learn equations and formulas there. They learned something greater. They learned that prejudice has no place in education. They learned that respect is stronger than ridicule. And most importantly, they learned to never judge a person by the color of their skin, their background, or the assumptions others make. Because Marcus had shown them that strength often comes quietly, wrapped in patience and endurance, waiting for the right moment to rise. And when it does, it shines so brightly that no cruelty, no prejudice, no injustice can ever dim it. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring stories. And remember, when you share these stories, you're spreading a message the world needs to hear. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.